Hi, John.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Indian summer.
Good. What's that?
It's Indian summer here in Hoboken. I assume in
you mean Native
Princeton.
American summer, I think. Yesterday, by the way, was Columbus Day, was it not?
Yes, it was. And I woke up in the woods in the Hudson Highlands. I went on a 2-day retreat, just hiking in the woods to try to, gather my thoughts.
Yeah, well, you've got the kind of job where you get to do that. You get a lot of holidays and stuff, I guess. You get a whole summer off. You're kind of an academic, notwithstanding your background in journalism. Let me tell people about you in case they don't know. You're John Horgan, famous science journalist. You write, you have like a blog at Scientific American where you write contentious stuff that leads scientists to denounce you. You were well known for the book, The End of Science, The Undiscovered Mind, a number of books. I guess most recently your anti-war book, is that it? No. Then there's the mind-body problem, which has an accompanying, not only is available for free on the internet if people go to the right place, but there's an accompanying series of podcasts on meaningoflife.tv, which is also, of course, the network on which this will be seen, in addition to being available on the Wright Show podcast. That's
right. Thanks for the plug. Is this going to be, where will this appear? Meaning of Life TV?
It will, unless we veer into politics in some bizarre way and forget to talk about scientism and stuff, which was our plan. So it's kind of complicated. My show, The Wright Show, it's always in the Wright Show podcast feed as an audio podcast, but some episodes as a video matter are on meaningoflife.tv and some are on bloggingheads.tv, depending on whether they deal with the meaning of life or with random stuff.
Politics. It's all entangled, Bob.
It's all entangled.
Of life, science, politics. Yeah. Really hard to keep them apart.
No, and the roots run deep, and ultimately it's the deep state. Ultimately, this is an expression of the deep state. So,
okay, bring it on.
Let's see. We're going to talk about scientism. There was and whatever else we wind up talking about. It could go anywhere. We've known each other a pretty long time, so you never know what'll break out here. And we've actually had our share of contentions over the years because you've been wrong about some things, and it's been my duty to correct you, and you don't always accept that gracefully.
Well, you sometimes have veered toward ideological certainty when it comes to Darwin and Buddha, and I try to point out some of the flaws in your thinking, and you're always very gracious about accepting that I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So science. There was an occasion recently, and maybe you can set the stage for us for thinking about scientism, which I would define as kind of an exaggerated sense of the proper realm of authority of science, or, when scientists start kind of intruding in certain areas where they may not, first of all, be welcome, like maybe in philosophy or other humanities, and secondly, and arguably may not, may exceed just the kind of, I don't know, epistemological bounds or something. They may actually have an exaggerated sense for how much science can tell us. I mean, for me, the one good example is the Sam Harris book, The Moral Landscape, where the subtitle was something like How Science Can Determine Human Values. I forget the exact phrase, but there was determine in values in the subtitle. I would call that
that's pretty classic scientism. Deriving ought from is. If you grant that science is telling us how the world works, and then you draw ethical conclusions from that, which I think even most scientists would say is a very risky thing to do. Mm-hmm. But you want me to tell you what this is? Latest.
So why don't you set the stage? By the way, I just realized I forgot to tell people exactly what the academic part of your identity is. You're at the Stevens Institute of Technology, is it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
which by the way, I read somewhere. I read somewhere that students there have really high incomes in the end, right?
They do well when they get out. It's a high return on investment, and the administration of the school would be thrilled to hear you mention that.
I just thought I'd mention it.
Because
they all wind up making more money than you're making as a professor of what? Of science writing?
I've never really known what my title is. I think I'm called an assistant teaching professor because I don't have a PhD. I teach science writing. I teach a class called War and Science that is really just about my book, The End of War. And I teach freshman humanities, which I really enjoy. And it's basically, it's a class about, stuff that John Horgan is thinking about and wants you to think about also. I like teaching the freshmen because their minds are still fresh and unformed. And I can have I like to think I can have a real effect on them. Yeah,
I taught a couple of freshman seminars at Princeton, and and it really is gratifying in exactly that way. They're open-minded, which will not last forever.
That's right.
So scientism. So set the stage. This was a controversy involving Jerry Coyne and Steven Pinker and an historian of science who wrote a thing for Nature, the esteemed journal, as part of the commemoration of its 150th anniversary, right?
Yeah. So Nathaniel Comfort is an historian of science at Johns Hopkins, and he happens to be coming to my school to give a talk tomorrow, October 16th, about the origin of life. He was going to talk about genetic determinism, which he's written a lot about, but I have somebody else who's going to be talking about that same topic in another month. So I asked him to focus on the origin of life, which he's also written about. So anyway, Comfort wrote this essay that's part of some anniversary for Nature. I forget exactly what it is.
I think it's the 150th anniversary.
Okay, and so they're
Nature was like the really, really super august.
Yeah, Nature,
the British equivalent of Science.
Yes, and I'd say Nature maybe even has a little more prestige. It's
older. I think
it's older than Science, but those are the two premier science journals.
Like that's where Watson and Crick wrote their paper, I think, in Nature and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So Comfort was asked to write a kind of big picture essay on where science is now. And he decided to write about sort of our changing notions of self that science has given us over the centuries, and how sometimes that can lead us to think, or lead some scientists to say, that they know who we really are. This is I'm using my own terms now, but this is basically what Comfort is addressing. So he's first looking back at Darwin, theory of evolution by natural selection, and then bringing us up into the 20th century, looking at genetics, the discovery of the double helix, and then all these things that have happened recently in immunology and developmental biology. And Comfort is pointing out that science is constantly telling us this is what you really are. You're an organism that's shaped by natural selection. You are a self with an immune system that tries to distinguish between you and the rest of the world. You're a collection of genes that are trying to pass themselves into the next generation. And Comfort is pointing out that some scientists and some science lovers have had this tendency to think that science has really figured out who we are, and that it has a definition of humanity that the rest of us should agree on. Comfort. Let me just give you his definition of science, because it's a little bit different than the one I would use. He says scientism says that science is the only way to understand the world and solve social problems. And as examples of this, he points out some of the more insidious byproducts of science, like social Darwinism and eugenics, in which legitimate science has been turned into a kind of ideology, a political platform for doing various things that culminated in the 20th century in the Nazi regime, which was kind of eugenics taken to its extreme. And Comfort is trying to distinguish between science, which is constantly telling us real things about our bodies and about our relationship with the rest of nature, and Comfort reveres science. I assume that's why he became a science historian. He's just deploring this tendency to take some scientific theories and to use them for political ends, and in which they become really an ideology rather than something more scientific.
Yeah. So, yeah, he's doing a couple of things, it seems to me. I mean, I didn't think he was doing anything that was quite worth the intensity of denunciation that Jerry Coyne mustered. But then again, Jerry Coyne is a champion of intense denunciation, kind of regardless of the magnitude of the crime he's denouncing. And that's what Steve Pinker picked up on. I mean, Steve often kind of kind of looks at what Jerry Coyne is doing and tweets it and then Jerry Coyne kind of ritually worships Steve Pinker, and that's what got Comfort's attention, right? The Steve Pinker tweet, like, and then Jerry Coyne complains about how much time he spent talking about Steve Pinker tweet. Anyway, back to what Comfort actually said. I mean, there were the first part that you alluded to. Yeah, he got into how science reshapes our conception of self. I don't think he's really complaining about that, because for one thing, scientists, it's not really like when he says, more recently, cell and molecular studies have relaxed the borders of the self. In other words, the conception of the self. Or like immunology, what does he say about that? Immunology redefined the self in terms of non-self. Well, there's very few scientists who have actually had that thought, I would suspect. I mean, this is him saying one takeaway from science, in the minds of some people, may be to change their conception of self. A, I'm not sure how much that actually has happened, but B, I don't think he's complaining about that. I guess you're right. I mean, let me read one paragraph where I think he is complaining. Since the Enlightenment, we have tended to define human identity and worth in terms of the values of science itself, as if it alone could tell us who we are. That is an odd and blinkered notion. And then he gets into, this probably really drove Jerry Coyne nuts, because it starts lapsing into, standard left-wing stuff here. It's like, in the face of colonialism, slavery, opioid epidemics, environmental degradation, climate change, the idea that Western science and technology are the only reliable sources of self-knowledge is no longer tenable. This isn't to lay all human miseries at science's feet, far from it. The problem is scientism. Defining the self only in biological terms tends to obscure other forms of identity, such as one's labor or social role. Maybe the answer to Huxley's question of questions isn't a number after all. Okay, so
we're going to have to define postmodernism too here.
We don't have, as if we don't have enough on our hands. Well, just hold on a second. So before we do that, so what Comfort is a postmodernist. I mean, that's what Coyne accuses him of being, I think, right?
I don't know. I don't know hardly anybody. I know a lot of people who I think are postmodernists, but I know only one person who proudly calls himself a postmodernist, and it's an historian of science at Stevens named Jim McClellan. I'm not sure if Comfort thought of himself as a postmodernist, but I think his essay has a kind of postmodern assumption to it, which I would define as a kind of doubt and skepticism and historical awareness of how rapidly theories are generated and overturned. So it's kind of, in Comfort's case, and I'd say this is true of me too, you love what science tells us about ourselves, but you don't see any statements of science as kind of the last word. You know that there's going to be this continued revision in our understanding of ourselves, and that we're always going to be somewhat mysterious to ourselves. And I think, and I don't see that as anything very exceptional. until you add that, which a lot of postmodernists do, and which Comfort also does in his essay, that many of our ideas about ourselves and our ideas about our world are shaped by our cultural biases and even reflect sort of power structures, vested interests in the culture of the scientists. And that's why Comfort is bringing up the fact that most science has been done by white males of European descent rather than disabled female people of color. So that's kind of a standard postmodern move as well. And again, I don't even see that as I see that as I mean, I guess it's political correctness to an extent, but I think I applaud it. I think science also could benefit from more diversity. I think you'd have a different kind of science if science it was more inclusive. And I would hope that Steve Pinker and Jerry Coyne would agree with that as well.
They certainly wouldn't argue that it should forever remain the province of white males. I don't think I think they think that there's a version of postmodernism that is more of there is no such thing as truth. That I think they say, and I don't know to what extent this is a problem. When I read Steve's book Enlightenment Now, and he went on and on about kind of at least at the end about postmodernism, I was thinking, is this really such a problem? I don't know any of these. People don't walk up to me and say there's no such thing as truth, and so we can't trust any of science's findings. But I think that is the concern, is that that there are postmodernists who want to undermine the very foundations for talking as if we know anything,
This goes back to, among others, Thomas Kuhn, who, although he disavowed it, he didn't like being called a postmodernist. He's sort of a godfather of postmodernism, at least as it's applied to at least as it's applied to science. Because postmodernism also, there are versions of it in philosophy and literature. But that kind of extreme skepticism where you don't believe in the atomic theory of matter, you don't believe in the genetic code, you don't believe in the natural evolution by natural selection. I haven't really encountered it. I just mentioned this really good friend of mine, Jim McClellan, a historian of science at Stevens, who was Kuhn's student at Princeton back in the early 70s. And he's really still a Kuhnian after all these years. And like Kuhn, my friend Jim thinks that science is our most powerful way of knowing the world. Mm-hmm. And it has all these extraordinary achievements. But Jim says that we should never think that science has given us absolute truth. Jim likes to call scientific theories stories that are constantly, that this is the best story we can put forward now, but it will surely be replaced by other stories in the future. The idea is that science never converges on a true picture of the world. And I actually think that's bullshit. I think that science gets a lot of things right once and for all, but there are other areas where science is constantly spinning its wheels, and you can ask whether it will ever really get a grasp of what it's trying to understand. And I think the most obvious example of that is us, the science of human nature, the science of the mind and brain of humanity. It does not get the same kind of attraction that physics gets when it's trying to understand elementary.
Yeah, but there are things that I think we can say with tremendous confidence at this point. We can say, for example, that life, that natural selection is an extremely important force. that which animals did the best job of which genes were most conducive to their own replication has a whole lot to do with why organisms are the way they are, including human beings. And I think we can go further and say with a very high degree of confidence. I mean, I agree that in a certain strict sense, you can never say anything with 100.000 forever zeros% confidence. But I think there are things we can say with 99.9% confidence.
Oh, I think there are things we can say with 100% confidence. I once had a conversation with my friend Jim where he said, we're arguing back and forth about whether there's such a thing as an absolute truth. And he said, give me a single example of an absolute truth. And I said, the earth is round and not flat. And he said, the earth isn't round. It's an oblate spheroid. And I said, okay. The earth is an oblate spheroid.
Well, but strictly speaking, your brain could be in a vat and it could be a simulation and there could be no earth. So right. There's at least a 0.00001% chance of that. That's all I mean. There is, I mean, that's not all I mean, but it's one thing I mean, is that a certain amount of epistemological doubt is always in order. Now, with natural selection, but I think what drives people like Steve Pinker crazy, and I'm to some extent with him on this, is there are people who say, I mean, he's of course an evolutionary psychologist. I've written sympathetically about evolutionary psychology and was doing so early on. We both believe that there are at least some psychological differences between men and women, I would say, especially in the realm of like sexual/romantic behavior and so on, sexual psychology, including, things, somewhat subtle things like the exact nature of jealousy and so on. We think there's very good reason to believe that there are these are average differences, of course. There are always going to be individuals who don't conform, but that there are average differences that we have a pretty high degree of confidence have at least some basis in the genes. And there are people who want to deny that there are any such differences at all. And I think I think they're just not really seriously grappling with the evidence.
The funny thing is that I'm accused of scientism by some philosopher friends I know because I accept that we are organisms, that humans are organisms shaped by natural selection. I think evolutionary psychology has interesting things to say about our behavior and even about possible distinctions between males and females. I recently tried to get a philosopher in my department to read Robert Trivers' paper on the evolution of reciprocal altruism, because I said that, if you're a philosopher of morality, you should know about this. Even if you disagree with it, you should know what you're disagreeing with. If you're, trying to completely disavow anything that biology has to contribute to moral philosophy. But then, I guess because I'm a contrarian, when I'm talking to somebody like you or when I'm talking to Robert Trivers, I like to point out that it's really hard to distinguish between biology and environment when it comes to even something like sexual behavior. Women are, so the evolutionary psychologists say that women are instinctively more coy sexually than
I'm not sure many would put it quite that way, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, then males
that in certain ways women tend to be more discerning about sexual partners they're attracted to. I mean, for example, men are more aroused by the mere sight, by sheerly visual cues, with having no knowledge about the actual person and requiring none to get aroused. And so this seems to. Among the data that they're trying to explain here is that why is it that in all cultures where there's pornography, in the sense of just, visual stuff that arouses people, why is it overwhelmingly a male thing? Now, it could be cultural. That's not impossible in principle. It's not like they're just saying, well, if it's in all cultures, it must be in their genes. There's a lot more argument and evidence, and that's what people don't understand, because they don't want to get into the argument. They don't want to really grapple.
All I'd like to do is point out that a young girl, first of all, is being told to watch out for boys. They're going to take advantage of you. She learns early on that there are consequences for her sexuality that boys don't have. So they're constantly, there's this environmental reinforcement of certain norms of behavior that make it hard to disentangle the relative contributions of biology.
Absolutely. It's a very hard problem.
That's all I'm saying. So, I want to go back to scientism.
And of course, culture can have a huge influence on the extent to which this expresses itself. In fact, it's not impossible in principle to get it to not express itself at all, right?
Right.
It's just that you would. The point is that you would have to do something to completely neutralize the expression of it, because all other things being equal, in the absence of kind of countervailing cultural forces and so on. And look, I think this is useful information in principle.
I do too. What bothered me about evolutionary psychology was the way that it became some of the practitioners, and I thought you had a little bit of this a while ago. Now
I deny it. Whatever you're going to say.
Now that you're a Buddhist, I think you've transcended this kind of behavior. But there was an ideological fervor to evolutionary psychology in the 1990s that bothered me. I thought there was a kind of overreaching that was characteristic of scientism. But before you respond to that, let me just say something about scientism in general. I think the most extreme period of scientism was actually in the 1980s and 1990s when, I was just starting in science journalism. I was covering a lot of different fields, but I was also covering physics. And there was this extraordinary idea in the air that came from Stephen Hawking, Steven Weinberg, and some other famous physicists, that they were going to figure the world out. They were going to tell us how the universe came into being, why the universe is this way rather than some other way, how it was that a universe emerged that allowed for our existence. Hawking and Weinberg and others were talking about a theory of everything, a unified theory of physics that would answer all these ancient questions that really religion was invented to answer. And at the same time, you had Richard Dawkins in Blind Watchmaker saying that the problem of life has basically been solved. It was solved by Darwin's theory of natural selection. You had Francis Crick talking about the possibility, this is the late 80s and early 90s, of consciousness, which is kind of like the enigma at the heart of the mystery of existence. Consciousness could be solved scientifically. So there was this tremendous hubris and confidence in scientists in science that they could figure everything out. And to me, that's kind of the essence of science, of scientism. And by the way, of course, all these people were atheists. Stephen Hawking was a hardcore atheist, hated religion. So did Richard Dawkins, and Steven Weinberg. And I think that this idea that science is going to crush all these nonsensical, superstitious ways that we've had in the past of knowing the world, I think that's really that's also part of the essence of science.
Okay.
And you mentioned before Sam Harris, of course, a hardcore atheist. His first book was The End of Faith. I think of Lawrence Krauss, the physicist.
So telling us that now we know why there is something rather than nothing. He has put to bed this ancient philosophical conundrum, which was just complete 100% bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry, and I think at some level he knew it. I don't know, but
my phone's just started to ring.
Was that Lawrence Krauss? Lawrence?
I thought I just muted the let me go turn off my phone.
No, I want to hear who's calling. No, leave it on. I want to hear who's calling.
It's just spam.
Hello, Chip. This is Lawrence. Oh, no one knows that your nickname was Long Chip.
I was going to say, why would Lawrence Krauss worry about what I think. But then I remembered I did write that nasty thing about him after I thought he treated you badly in that public event.
Oh, yeah. Now it's coming out that I actually have an agenda with Lawrence Krauss. I do. I do have an agenda with him.
Well, anyway, we
can link to that. It was an interesting conversation between me and him that was in public. And what annoyed me about it is, like, we had paid him a big honorarium to come and talk. And I just thought he was like stonewalling. He just wasn't, he had his like new atheist fan people in the crowd, and he was just like playing to the crowd. And I had actual serious questions I wanted to ask him. And so I got kind of annoyed, so I think this is an opportunity to do a kind of varieties of scientism thing, because you've mentioned several things. Let me first of all plead guilty to the charge of evangelicism. I mean, in my 1994 book on evolutionary psychology, The Moral Animal, had a certain evangelical air. It was arguing that we can understand a lot about human nature through this paradigm, which I still believe. So I'm not really apologizing for it, but it is.
Me too. Me too. Not as much as you.
You know, it was kind of evangelical. Now, I will say that one variety of scientism, which you alluded to earlier when you talked about inferring is or ought from is, that surfaces with EvPsych all the time. When Time Magazine, and in those days, it was a great break for that book to be excerpted on the cover of Time Magazine, back when Time Magazine was Time Magazine. And what it said on the cover was it had a big wedding ring, and it said, and it said, infidelity, it may be in our genes, which was, I was a little ambivalent about. That was much more simple sounding than anything I actually said in the book or the excerpt. And I thought the more interesting and subtle part was how subtly our psychology works in these realms and everything. But anyway, I have no doubt that there are people somewhere in America, guys, who looked at that cover and thought, well, if it's in our genes, I'll cheat on my wife, right? And that is a danger. I mean, there's the naturalistic fallacy version of it. If it's natural, it must be good. And then there's the second version, which is the simplistic idea that, well, if it's in any sense in our genes, there's no way to control it, which is also wrong. But you also mentioned some other things that I think represent maybe other varieties of scientism. So
theories of everything.
Yeah. At least arguably physics. They do.
Let me just point out that scientism, not to overwhelm people with isms here, but scientism is very closely associated with atheism, which I just pointed out, but also with reductionism and materialism. And, reductionism is kind of what science does. You try to explain a lot of different things with one thing. You have a simple explanation for lots of variety.
Well, there is a pejorative usage of the term reductionist to mean too simple, simplistic, but there's also the kind of more formal philosophical sense in which some scientists would say, yeah, that's what I do. I try to reduce phenomena to kind of, in an explanatory way, to simpler, I try to reduce the chemistry to physics, right? I tried, and so on.
And another ism is materialism, the assumption that reality basically consists of matter. That's the foundation of everything. And then you get this odd stuff that happens as a result of certain kinds of matter, like life and consciousness. But you're only going to explain life and consciousness by looking at the material underpinnings. That's what materialists assume. And I think that the height of, I realize looking back at my advanced age now, at over the last few decades, that I became a science writer when all those isms were at their peak: scientism, atheism, at least scientific atheism, materialism, and reductionism. And scientists were just so full of themselves, and rightfully so. The first half of the 20th century had seen all these extraordinary accomplishments in the physical and biological sciences. And so I think it was reasonable for scientists to think that they can figure all this shit out. They can really understand the world, not just the physical realm, but biology and the human mind once and for all. And I actually bought into that. I originally thought that this might happen. And when I started thinking about the end of science, this book that I wrote came out in 1996, the idea was that maybe scientists really are going to figure everything out. But then I quickly realized that there was very little chance of that happening. But I did take the idea of what you might call scientific omniscience seriously. I just wrote a piece looking back on that period in which I call it the delusion of scientific omniscience, in which I think that we never should have taken that idea seriously. There are always really good reasons to disbelieve the claim that there would be a theory of everything in physics or in biology. And science, I think, will never get back to that kind of hubris and arrogance and certainty. There is still scientism, but it's not nearly as pervasive as it was a couple of decades ago, because science, I'd say, has been humbled over the last few decades.
Well, in some ways, it's been humbled by science. I mean,
yes.
Let me say, first of all, I shouldn't, when I said, I think Lawrence Krauss at some level knew that what he was saying was bullshit. I shouldn't say that. I actually basically don't believe it. I mean, I think people are very good at convincing themselves that whatever they're saying is true. And maybe we'll have time to get into what exactly I consider ridiculous about his argument, his claim that he could now tell us why there's something, or that physics could now tell us why there's something rather than nothing. Anyway, that's just a little mea culpa. But I mean, first of all, what I still believe is that science is going to tell us more and more for some time to come about, for example, human psychology. I think our understanding will grow. But I think it is also pointing to some things that may be fundamental limits. And one of them, you mentioned materialism. I think quantum physics, among other things, and physics in general, is raising doubts about the word materialism. Because increasingly it's looking like at some kind of foundational level of once you get to the level of subatomic particles, it's like we don't really have an easy way to conceptualize what the actual nature of reality is. I had a conversation about this with the philosopher Gideon Rosen that we can link to. But so there's that. There's materialism, and then you mentioned consciousness, and I think, although I think we'll know more and more about human psychology, it may well be that the mind-body problem per se, understanding why there is subjective experience, and also like what exactly is the interface like between what we think of as the material world and subjective experience and consciousness, that may, I'm not sure, but it may remain forever beyond our capacity to understand. And I think there's a clearer understanding of those two things than there was maybe 20 years ago. I mean, I don't know when Dan Dennett's book came out, Consciousness Explained.
Like 1990s.
Early 90s maybe, or something. But for a while, people were like, oh, cool. And I think now I think the philosophical tide has turned against him. I personally think rightly so.
Absolutely.
I personally think what he's doing is actually arguing that consciousness doesn't exist, although he gets upset when you accuse him of really thinking that.
He's basically saying, I really tried hard to understand exactly what Dennett was saying. I wrote a blog post about it. He's basically saying that consciousness is so trivial when it comes to our biological functioning and behavior that it might as well not exist.
Okay, but here's the point. Here is one of the points. It may indeed be that consciousness is functionally redundant, more than trivial, just that it doesn't do anything. I mean, that's one model of consciousness, is that it's epiphenomenal and that its relation to my physical brain is like the relation of the shadow of my hand to my hand. In other words, my hand influences the shadow doesn't influence my hand. Maybe consciousness is like a shadow, fine. But if that's the case, that only deepens the mystery, because remember, consciousness is the reason life has meaning, at least in my view. The fact that it's like something to be alive, we can experience pleasure or pain, that's what gives the world moral stakes. So if what gives the world moral meaning is something that functionally is superfluous, that didn't have to be here, I mean, that gives rise to all kinds of interesting speculations, including probably some theistic ones that Dan wouldn't like, right? I mean, in other words, if the thing that gives life meaning didn't have to be here, and David Chalmers has kind of metaphorically said God didn't have to put consciousness into the world. Now, he doesn't mean God, but the
God
language
in the Einstein sense.
What's that?
God in the Einstein sense, just sort of,
Yeah, well, just that whatever is responsible for the universe and the nature of the universe, if it didn't have to include consciousness in order for the universe to function as it functions, and even for us to function as we function, then that's kind of mind blowing. Like, why is it here then?
Yeah, okay, let me just sort of riff on what you just said. I think we're in agreement on. Well, first of all, I don't think that consciousness is a solvable problem. I guess that makes me a Mysterian. I think that we might find physical processes that are correlated with certain states of consciousness. This is what Francis Crick wanted to do back in the 1990s, and his acolyte Christoph Koch is still trying to do something like that. But that model, that materialist model of consciousness, isn't that popular right now. There are all these competing theories that are not strictly materialist. In fact, Koch himself has supported something called integrated information theory, which says that the fundamental stuff of existence is information, which is kind of this dualistic substance that incorporates a little bit of mind and a little bit of matter. So what's extraordinary about what's happened to science over the last couple of decades and moving away from the period of scientism is that I think there's a recognition that some problems might be impossible to solve. It doesn't mean we should stop trying, but I think we might have to accept that there are lots of different answers, lots of different possible answers to some questions like the mind-body problem. This was a theme of my most recent book, The Mind-Body Problem, which is why I called it Mind-Body Problems.
Oh, right. I got the title wrong, didn't I? Yeah, it's Mind-Body Problems.
Mind-Body Problems, because I think that, in a way, choosing a solution to the mind-body problem is like coming up with a personal identity. It's something that reflects our aspirations and our fears, our life experiences. And what's interesting in science is that there seem to be some of these deep questions, like what's going on with quantum mechanics? What does quantum mechanics really mean? Where you have all these different possibilities, all these different interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds theory, the old Copenhagen interpretation, the Bohmian pilot wave interpretation, and physicists and philosophers are passionate about different interpretations, but there's no way of empirically determining which one is correct. So you're left with these subjective judgments that lead you to prefer one over the other. I think that's true with theories of consciousness as well, and more broadly, responses to the mind-body problem. I just wrote a post on this too. I'm more and more gravitating toward a position that's sometimes called scientific pluralism, which says that there might not be a single absolute definitive true answer to some of these really deep questions that we have. There might be lots of answers, and you pick the one that suits you best, and that's going to be unsatisfying for the true believers in science who thought that there had to be convergence on one correct way of seeing the world. But I think that this pluralism just reflects the limits of science and the richness and complexity of the world.
Yeah. And I think, and I want to underscore that science itself has done the service of kind of emphasizing its own possible limits.
Yeah. I give science credit for that.
And, certainly in the realm of kind of subatomic physics. Now, we may learn more that'll clarify the foundational level of reality. But right now, it's looking like the deeper we go, in a certain sense, the less sense it makes.
Hey, listen, if you would allow me to brag a little bit,
I'm afraid we've got to go. I'm afraid our time's up.
I've done something kind of newsworthy recently, and I'm just going to tell the Blogging Heads audience about it. I already told readers of my blog about it for Scientific American. In 2002, I made a bet with Michio Kaku, best-selling author and physicist Michio Kaku, who often sort of presents himself as a major player in string theory, even though he's not really, to be honest, but he's a great popularizer. And we had a bet over whether there would be a Nobel Prize for work related to string theory or any other kind of unified theory of physics by 2020. And by the way, a unified theory of physics is something that explains all the particles and all the forces of nature in one tidy package. Now you've got a situation where you've got quantum field theory, which explains electromagnetism and the nuclear forces, and you've got general relativity, which explains gravity, and those just don't fit together. So physicists have been trying, since Einstein, have been trying to come up with a unified theory to explain all the forces in one tidy package. String theory was the major candidate, but from the start, string theory was postulating these phenomena at scales that were much too small ever to be accessed directly by any experiment. So that led me to be a string theorist, string theory skeptic from the very start. Kaku and lots of other people are very enthusiastic about string theory. So we put up some serious money, $1,000 each, under the auspices of something called the Long Bet Foundation. Kaku's last chance to win the bet was this fall. This is the last prize for physics given before 2020. And needless to say, string theory nor any other unified theory won a bet. And as I said, I thought the writing was on the wall back in the 1990s that string theory would be a dead end. And I don't know what's going to happen with the quest for a unified theory, but I would assume, because of some of these problems with empirical evidence that all the unified theories have, that there just isn't going to be as much interest in it.
Has Kaku acknowledged that you won the bet? He
has not yet. I wrote him, and I'm pretty sure he's aware of it because the piece that I wrote for Scientific American went viral.
Well, partly I thought your tweet about it was I don't want to say misleading, but when the tweet alluded to thanks to so-and-so for it was the day the Nobel Prizes had come out, and your tweet was something like, thanks to so-and-so for congratulating me on my Nobel win. Yeah, I'd click on that link. I thought you had won the Nobel Prize. It's very clever.
Oh, come on. That's, a little bit of grandiosity there.
Yeah, no, that was good marketing.
Just in jest.
Yeah. It's funny. I actually there's a tape somewhere of me interviewing Michio Kaku like almost 20 years ago. Actually, when Meaning of Life TV first started, it was 20 years ago that I started. But before you could even do this, like tape a video conversation remotely. So I actually went around with cameras interviewing people, and those interviews are still available, but I never got the one of Michio Kaku edited. What I remember was he got really kind of irate because I seemed to be skeptical of I think what we were talking about was many worlds, the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, which he was accepting. And I was like, so you think that like right now in this room, there's also dinosaurs? or something like that. It was something like that. And he said yes. And he sensed my skepticism and maybe, I don't know, but anyway.
Well, he's a classic gee whiz science writer who just loves theories that have spectacular implications, which is true of string theory, which is true of
which
the
I think is
theory.
kind of fine. I mean, to get people excited about the philosophical possibilities of physics, because all of it's true that quantum physics has driven people to the point where they, really smart people are entertaining theories that sound crazy, right? I mean, like many worlds sounds crazy, and yet it's almost like there's no non-mind-blowing interpretation of quantum physics, and that's kind of interesting. Yeah, it is.
So just going back, I'm looking for some way to sort of wrap things up on a really with a note of grandiosity and
a grand unified theory of scientism.
I think we're entering not an age of doubt, but a period when science is going to go through some very serious self-questioning, and I think that's a good thing. It's the opposite of scientism. I've always preached that science needs more modesty and humility, and there's some scientists who have plenty of that, but the ones with the platform, unfortunately, tend toward arrogance. But I think that given the replication crisis, for example, this is
social psychology in particular.
Well, but it's throughout science, actually. The acknowledgement or this recognition that the scientific literature is rotten, and that more than half of the claims, and this has actually been measured, that are made in peer-reviewed journals turn out not to be corroborated. And yes, it's the biggest problem in the fields with the most at stake financially. So that's biomedicine.
Well, not only, but also with, you might say, ideological implications or social. There are people who go into certain fields because they do have, and this isn't a bad, I don't indict them for this. I mean, we all have our views about what's wrong with society and how it might be fixed. And there are people who go into fields like social psychology with particular ideas about how easily things could be fixed. And that can influence the kinds of experiments they do and whether there are enough psychologists who disagree with them ideologically to be motivated to try to overturn their findings. I mean, that happens too. There's like, in a way, this brings us back to postmodernism, because except it's just a postmodernism light. It's like the fact that human motivation, human nature in various ways can corrupt science. I mean, in principle, what science is supposed to do is overcome the problem of human blindness, because you can put your theory out there, but so long as it's stated in a way that it's testable, right, then even if you are blinded by your own commitment to the theory, other people will come and do these experiments that ultimately disprove your hypothesis. And so, in a way, science does take into account the problem of human nature. But what we're learning now is that in various fields, it doesn't work very efficiently to overcome that problem. And there are various corrupting influences, including, as you mentioned, just money, like pharmacological research.
Right. Psychiatry is, I think, one of the most cartoonishly apt examples of where postmodernism is right on. I mean, you can sort of a crude version of postmodernism is what journalists say all the time, which is follow the money. If you're trying to understand why somebody is saying something, try to look at whether they have ulterior financial motives for saying that. And you cannot understand modern psychiatry, and especially the huge increase in prescriptions for drugs for various psychiatric disorders, without looking at the influence of the pharmacological companies behind them.
It's great that journalists say follow the money, but they should also be saying follow the journalists, because the fact is that journalism, science journalism, is itself. And again, look, I came up as a journalist. I've been guilty of this myself, but the fact is that the tendency of journalism to just grasp at and highlight the most sensational seeming finding, that is a corrupting influence in itself. I think some scientists work with a press release, maybe not consciously in mind, but, as you know, if you're a scientist who can get a story about your stuff on the front page of the New York Times, that's going to be super good for your career, at least in the short run. And your university is going to love you, and you're going to be more likely to get grants. Yeah. And I think in the realm, with social psychology, I think that's a factor. And, and it gets back to the fact that journalists, the business model they have to work in, which is that the most clicks wins. And there's always been some version of this. Back before the internet, it was like, you want your story on the front page. Now it's, you want the most traffic, but, it's like turtles all the way down. I don't know where the problem ends. It's like you just keep tracing the motivational biases back, like from the scientists to the journalists to the people who read the stories and either click or don't click. The problem is human nature.
Well, and evolutionary psychology, I guess, can help us understand our innate tendencies to deceive others and to deceive ourselves for self-interest. I just want to point out that I like to think I've been a sort of a little tiny counterforce in this cycle of hype. But, so I think I went into science journalism because I wanted to celebrate science, and I guess I wanted to market it and tell people about all the cool stuff scientists were discovering. And then I pretty quickly became jaded and realized that there was this big gap between the hype and the marketing and the reality of science. And so I took it upon myself to become a debunker, but it's not easy, I can tell you. And it's not a way to write a bunch of bestsellers to be saying, that stuff that you read about in that other book, it's a bunch of nonsense.
There's a niche. There's a kind of attention you can get. What it isn't is a way for you to have all scientists love you, and you can attest to that, right?
Yeah, I've got a few fans. But they tend to be scientists who are saying the same kinds of things that. And
I should say, I mean, I've accused you of going overboard in your, shall we say, doubt or skepticism, and in fact, we didn't even have time to get to the whole Napoleon Shagnon thing, did we? Maybe it's not too late. I don't know. But anyway, what I want to say is, I've accused you in person of like having the worldview that everyone is full of shit except for the people who say everyone is full of shit, which conveniently is John Horgan. Right?
No, I think I'm pretty.
No, I want to say it's a productive worldview. I mean, given the number of people we have whose job seems to be to lap up uncritically the latest claim by anyone with a PhD who has a job at a university, it's good. Even if I think you sometimes go overboard, it's good to have people like you who view universal skepticism as their mission.
Well, thanks for that. My assumption is, and I think it's borne out by history, is that humans are dangerous when they're filled with certitude. It leads to self-righteousness, and it can lead to actual bad things happening in the world, to genocide and wars and terrible oppression, or just to, unpleasant dogmatism and shutting down of alternative ways of seeing the world. I can assure you, Bob, and I hope you realize this, knowing me for all this time, that I am filled with self-doubt.
And I rightly think so, I would add.
Good one. And I try to infect other people. I try to do this with my freshman students. I'm not trying to tell them what to think. I'm trying to get them to doubt whatever they think, whatever they believe, and to doubt all authority figures, including their grizzled old professor.
Good. I would encourage that last thing in particular, skepticism of you. Okay, well, we've covered a lot. It's been It's been about an hour, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe we should call it a day, I think. I mean, we didn't have a chance to really drill down and ask, and try to get super clear on what is and isn't scientism. Is saying consciousness explains scientism. We also didn't have time to get into this thing that you mentioned, Steven Weinberg, this thing he did where he said the more we learn about the universe, the more we realize how pointless it is. In other words, saying that science has kind of discovered that there's no larger purpose. I thought that was kind of going, in a certain sense, I thought that was simplistic, but.
Well, I think it's true.
But it isn't. It isn't. I mean, exactly. A good example is what I was just saying. I think we have a clearer sense for how mysterious consciousness is now. And given the fact that it is what gives life meaning, I think science has actually clarified the mysteriousness of consciousness by helping us see more precisely the correlates between brain activity and consciousness. That in turn led to this naive, I think, conclusion of Dan Dennett's that, well, it's explained. And then you realize that wait, no, even if you assume the precise correlates, that doesn't explain the fundamental question. And that deepens the sense of mystery, which I think, and I think if that works in any way relative to the question of purpose, it should lead you to entertain the possibility of purpose.
Yeah, it's funny. You're more open to ideas of God and sort of some kind of ultimate purpose than I am. I guess I'm more of an existentialist than you are. I agree with Steve Weinberg. I think that science has helped to demolish, helped to finish off the work that philosophers like Nietzsche started in the 19th century. It's helped to demolish the idea that there is a God, that there's any overarching purpose to existence. But that leaves us free.
How has it done that?
But that leaves us free to.
But wait, I didn't even understand what you're saying. It's like what specifically has science established that I'm universe, not. Let me emphasize. I'm talking about the possibility of purpose in various senses, some of which have nothing to do with any kind of established religion. I mean, for example, the hypothesis that we're in a simulation. If that's true, well, then there's a purpose. Then there's somebody who built this thing, even if it's only for their own entertainment. That's a purpose, right? So I'm just talking about purpose in the broadest sense, and I'm asking, how has science told us that this universe has no purpose?
It can't tell us.
No, it can't. Exactly.
It can't tell us, but so it leaves us free to imagine any kind of purpose and meaning that we like. And this gets back to my point about pluralism. If you were looking for science to confirm, the sense of purpose that you get from Judaism and Christianity and Islam, that there's this divine force that created us and it wants certain things from us, and if we do certain things, then we will be rewarded. That's gone. I think for anybody with any kind of intellectual
I don't think it's gone
honesty.
I don't think it's gone in a generic sense. I think that the social sciences and history and archaeology and everything, and just our awareness that there's all these different religious traditions, strengthen the argument that, wait a second, there's a way to explain what there's reason to doubt the version of the story that religions have traditionally presented of themselves. Like, okay, there was this one guy, and the only way to explain what happened and all this whether it's the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, there were all these I think miracles and so on. I think everything we know now about history and the way stories get told and the way they change in the telling and everything. And some of this comes from science in the broad sense. I think cast doubt on those specific stories. But what I was saying was,
I've read your books, Bob. I know what your idea of what you mean by purpose, and I'm just saying I don't agree with it, and I agree.
No,
with
it isn't
Weinberg.
Just that you don't agree. You just asserted that science has told us there's no larger purpose.
I think science has made it very hard to believe any of the traditional stories that we have had about our purpose, our reason for being here. I think it's done that by expanding the universe immensely and showing that the Earth is just this little tiny speck of dust around a nondescript star. By showing that we weren't created by God a few thousand years ago, that we're descended from animals.
Not in a hands-on way.
That there's this enormous contingent. So, I think what Weinberg was saying, and what I've taken away from science, is that there's this randomness to our existence. There's a randomness to the creation of the universe. There's a randomness to the creation of life, and to our emergence. A couple 100,000 years ago.
We should have a whole conversation about purpose.
Yeah, but as I said,
because you're wrong, and it's important that you understand that. But it's clear that you're not going to come to understand it within the next 90 seconds.
I see it as liberating, what I'm talking about, and I don't think in a kind of meta way. In a kind of meta way, it's consistent with what you're saying. You're entitled to have your own view.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. I've been waiting all my life for that permission.
Of there being some kind of divine purpose to existence, but there's no way of knowing if you're right. There's no way of
course there's not. Of course there's not. I just think as a logical matter, again, this is just a conversation. This is a conversation unto itself. But I think as a logical matter, the idea that science is tending to extinguish the prospect for purpose is a case that hasn't been made. And B, I think in some ways, things that we now understand more clearly are actually suggestive of larger purpose in at least some sense, which, by the way, doesn't even mean the purpose would be inspiring. Could be depressing. Could be, I do think there are, uplifting themes in the arguments I would see for the possibility of purpose, but I want to be clear. I'm not, trying to sell right now any particular story. I just think you can actually draw on science and argue that in some ways, some aspects of science strengthen what is, of course, inherently a speculative argument for purpose. Of course. Let me
try to be conciliatory before we sign off on this. The way that I thought, I wrote about this in Rational Mysticism. How, if at all, does science intersect with these spiritual intuitions that we have in certain states? I think that science has demonstrated at this point that our existence is almost infinitely improbable. The fine-tuning problem of the universe, that it had to be created just so for us to exist. The origin of life. The more you study it, the harder it is to imagine how it started on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, and then the emergence of us from organisms that started as algae and bacteria is all just so improbable. There's this enormous randomness and contingency built into things, and yet here we are. So I think that it's a miracle that we exist. If you define a miracle as an infinitely improbable event that somehow happens, then I'd say our existence is a miracle. And in that sense, I think that science is profoundly compatible with our spiritual intuitions, that there must be some reason for us to be here and to be aware of our existence and determined to figure out why we're here. We don't know what that reason is, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one.
No, I think that is enough to start the Church of Horganism right there. And speaking of which, as we thank you for that note of conciliation, as we sign off with the promise to maybe have a future conversation about all this stuff, your Twitter handle is Horganism. Mm-hmm. My Twitter handle is Robert Reiter, WRIGHTER. What else do you want to plug? I put out the Nonzero newsletter. You can Google that and sign up. It's free.
Just my, you already made the plug. My book, Mind Body Problems with an S.com, right. Free online. And I'm always looking for feedback, which I post at the end of the book. And I've gotten lots of great comments so far, and I welcome more.
And if people go to meaningoflife.tv, they will see that there is a series of conversations you had called Mind Body Problems. They can click on it. There's a podcast feed, in fact, with all of those conversations, many of which certainly, maybe not all of which, but some of which are with the people that you wrote about in the book, right? Are any of them not about the people you wrote about?
Yeah, I've talked to some people like Jeffrey Kripal, and I've talked to your colleague Nikita Petrov. I recently talked to Frederick Cruz. None of them were in my book.
Okay, those are in the feed. The Frederick Cruz thing is great. He's a fascinating. He's a fascinating case, and there's a kind of just quickly, as maybe postmodernists would argue, his history shows you just how important it is when you've got like an argument you're making, just like political and social forces are, in whether it is or is not accepted. And he's of course a well-known critic of Freud, but that's a great conversation. Yeah,
he's a great person. That was fun for me to talk to him.
So we should go. But thanks again, John, for acknowledging the many deficiencies in your views.
Okay, Bob. I'll let you have the last word.
I'm kidding. I kid. Okay.
I know.
Thanks.
I didn't take it seriously.
Okay. All right. See ya.
Bye.